Archivists in Charleston found an 1895 photograph of 5 sisters. Zooming in revealed a faceless figure among them. The rain hammered against the windows of the Charleston County Archive building with a relentless rhythm that seemed to match the pounding in Sarah Chen's head. She had been hunched over the same photograph for 3 hours, her eyes straining against the amber glow of the restoration lamp. Outside, the September storm had transformed Meeting Street into a river of fallen palmetto fronds and debris, but Sarah barely noticed. Her entire world had contracted to the sepia-toned image beneath her magnifying glass. The photograph showed 5 young women arranged on the front steps of what Sarah had identified as the old Magnolia Asylum, a psychiatric institution that had operated on the outskirts of Charleston from 1867 until its controversial closure in 1924. The women wore identical white dresses, their hands folded demurely in their laps, their expressions ranging from vacant to vaguely troubled. According to the notation on the back of the photograph, written in faded copperplate script, they were the Whitmore sisters: Margaret, Eleanor, Catherine, Alice, and Jane, ages ranging from 16 to 24. The date stamp read August 15th, 1895. But it was the 6th figure that had stolen Sarah's sleep for the past week. Standing slightly behind and to the left of the seated sisters was a shape that her rational mind struggled to categorize. At first glance, it appeared to be another woman in the same white institutional dress. But when Sarah increased the magnification, when she adjusted the contrast and sharpened the resolution using the archive's digital enhancement software, the details dissolved into something that made her skin crawl. Where there should have been a face, there was only a smooth, flesh-colored oval, no eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just an unsettling blank expanse that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The figure's posture was rigid, unnatural, as if whoever it was had been propped up rather than standing of their own volition. Sarah's colleague Marcus Webb had laughed when she first showed him the image. "It's just degradation of the photographic plate," he had said, not unkindly. "You're seeing patterns in randomness. It happens with old collodion prints all the time. The emulsion breaks down unevenly." But Sarah had worked with 19th century photographs for 12 years. She knew degradation when she saw it. This was different. The rest of the image was remarkably well preserved. The sisters' faces were clear, their features distinct. The architectural details of the asylum's facade were crisp. Even the leaves on the oak tree in the background were sharp enough to count. Only that 6th figure was wrong. She rubbed her eyes and leaned back in her chair, feeling her spine pop in 3 places. The archive was empty except for her. Marcus had left at 6, casting her a worried glance as he pulled on his jacket. "You're becoming obsessed with this, Sarah," he had said. "It's just a photograph. It can't hurt you." But Marcus didn't know what Sarah had found in the asylum's admission records. He didn't know about the discrepancies, the crossed-out names, the entries that made no sense. He didn't know that according to official documentation, only 4 Whitmore sisters had ever been admitted to Magnolia Asylum. Not 5. 4. Sarah pulled up the scanned ledger on her second monitor. The page was dated August 10th, 1895, 5 days before the photograph was taken. In careful, meticulous handwriting, the admitting physician had recorded the arrival of Margaret Whitmore, aged 24, Eleanor Whitmore, age 22, Catherine Whitmore, age 19, and Alice Whitmore, age 16. The diagnosis for all 4 was the same: hysteria with melancholic tendencies. There was no mention of Jane. Sarah had cross-referenced the name against every document in the Magnolia Asylum collection. Jane Whitmore did not exist in any official capacity. No admission record, no treatment notes, no discharge papers. And yet there she was, in the photograph, sitting second from the left, her dark hair pulled back severely from a face that looked far older than her supposed 18 years. The thunder rolled across the peninsula, shaking the building's foundation. Sarah's phone buzzed with a severe weather alert, warning of flash flooding and possible tornadoes. She should go home. She should leave this mystery for tomorrow, get some sleep, approach it with fresh eyes. But something held her in her chair, some instinct honed by years of archival work that whispered she was close to understanding something important. She zoomed in on the faceless figure again, enhanced the image, adjusted the levels. And then she saw it. Around the figure's neck, barely visible against the white dress, was a dark band. Sarah increased the magnification until the pixels began to break apart. It wasn't a necklace. It was too thick, too uniform. It looked almost like a collar, a leather collar. Her hands were shaking as she opened a new search window and typed in Magnolia Asylum Restraints 1895. The results were sparse. The asylum's records had been poorly maintained, and much had been lost or deliberately destroyed after its closure. But she found a reference in a medical journal from 1897, an article by a Dr. Josiah Brennan titled Progressive Treatments for Female Nervous Disorders. Sarah downloaded the PDF and began to read. Within 3 paragraphs, her stomach was churning. Dr. E. Brennan described his innovative approach to treating women who displayed unnatural resistance to proper feminine comportment. His methods included prolonged isolation, sensory deprivation, and the use of what he called corrective apparatus, designed to train the body toward docility when the mind proved recalcitrant. One particular passage made Sarah's vision blur. For those patients who persist in vocal resistance, we have found that the application of a modified Scold's bridle, redesigned for therapeutic rather than punitive purposes, produces remarkable results. The device covers the lower face entirely, preventing speech while allowing for controlled feeding through a narrow aperture. Patients subjected to this treatment for periods of 3 to 6 months show a marked decrease in rebellious behavior and a corresponding increase in tractability. Sarah stared at the faceless figure in the photograph with new horror. Not faceless, masked. The smooth oval wasn't degradation or a photographic anomaly. It was a leather mask covering the lower half of someone's face, rendering them voiceless, anonymous, erased. She scrolled through more of Dr. Brennan's article, her heart racing. He mentioned 5 patients who had undergone his comprehensive treatment protocol with what he deemed satisfactory outcomes. 5 patients, 5 sisters, but the article didn't name them. Doctor-patient confidentiality, even in 1897, apparently had some standards. Sarah pulled up the asylum's staff records. Dr. Josiah Brennan had been the medical director of Magnolia Asylum from 1892 until 1902. After that, the trail went cold. No death certificate, no record of him practicing medicine anywhere else, no census data. He simply vanished from history. The lights flickered as another wave of thunder crashed overhead. Sarah's computer screen dimmed, then brightened again. In that moment of fluctuating light, she thought she saw movement in the photograph. Just a trick of the shadows, she told herself. Just her exhausted mind playing tricks. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. She reached for her phone to call Marcus, to tell him what she had found, to share this burden with someone else. But her hand froze halfway to the device, because there, in the enhanced image on her screen, she could now see something she had missed before. The 4 seated sisters were looking at the camera, their eyes focused on the lens, as subjects typically did in formal 19th century photography. But there was something else, something in their expressions. It wasn't just sadness or resignation. It was fear, raw, barely controlled terror, and they weren't looking at the camera. They were looking slightly to the left of it, at someone standing just out of frame. Sarah's mouth went dry. She zoomed out, taking in the full context of the photograph. The angle of the light suggested it was late afternoon. The shadows were long, stretching across the asylum's grounds, and there, Just barely visible at the edge of the frame was the shadow of a man, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing what appeared to be a top hat. The photographer? Or someone else? Sarah pulled up the photograph's metadata again. There was no photographer's mark, no studio stamp. Unusual for the time period. Most professional photographers stamped their work. This image had been taken by someone who didn't want their identity known. She stood up, needing to move, needing to process what she was uncovering. The archive's main room stretched out before her, rows of shelves packed with the detritus of Charleston's past. Birth records and death certificates, property deeds and court documents, newspapers and personal letters. 300 years of human experience, preserved in climate-controlled darkness. Somewhere in these shelves was the truth about the Whitmore sisters. Sarah was certain of it. She walked to the section housing Charleston County death records from the 1890s. The volumes were massive, leather-bound ledgers that smelled of mildew and decay. She ran her finger along the spines until she found 1896, pulled it down and carried it back to her desk. The pages crackled as she turned them, scanning for the surname Whitmore. January passed, then February, then March. Nothing. April brought a cluster of deaths from a yellow fever outbreak, but no Whitmores. May, June, July. The summer deaths were mostly children, victims of dysentery and typhoid. Sarah's heart ached as she read name after name. And then, on August 3rd, 1896, exactly 1 year and 18 days after the photograph was taken, she found it. Whitmore Margaret, age 25, cause of death, suicide by drowning. Location, Magnolia Asylum for Women. Informant, Dr. J. Brennan. Sarah's hands trembled as she continued down the page. 3 entries later. Whitmore Eleanor, age 23, cause of death, suicide by drowning. Location, Magnolia Asylum for Women. Informant, Dr. J. Brennan. She didn't need to keep reading, but she did. Catherine, age 20. Alice, age 17. All dead within a 24-hour period. All ruled suicides, all drowned. But there was no entry for Jane, because officially Jane had never existed. Sarah sat back, her mind reeling. 4 sisters admitted to an asylum for the crime of being inconvenient, of displaying behavior their family deemed inappropriate for proper young ladies, subjected to Dr. Brennan's horrific treatments. And then, a year later, all dead in what was almost certainly not a suicide pact. The missing sister, the one who didn't appear in any official record, haunted Sarah's thoughts. Had she escaped, been released, or had something worse happened? Something so unspeakable that even the asylum's inadequate records couldn't contain the lie. Sarah pulled up a search engine and typed in Whitmore Family Charleston, 1890s. The results were sparse but enlightening. The Whitmores had been a prominent family in Charleston society, owners of a successful rice plantation that had survived the Civil War and continued to operate profitably into the 20th century. John Whitmore, the patriarch, had served in the state legislature. His wife, Constance, was active in various charitable organizations. They had 5 daughters. Sarah found the information in a society column from 1888, discussing the family's annual Christmas ball. Margaret, Eleanor, Catherine, Alice, and Jane, all of marriageable age, all described as accomplished young ladies of refined sensibility. 7 years later, 4 of them were locked in an asylum. 1 had been erased from existence entirely. What had they done? What crime had they committed that warranted such punishment? Sarah dug deeper. Searching through newspaper archives, court records, church registries, she found fragments of the story, pieces that didn't quite fit together but painted a disturbing picture. In March of 1895, a scandal had rocked Charleston society. Someone had published an anonymous pamphlet criticizing the treatment of female workers at several textile mills in the area. The pamphlet detailed horrific working conditions, 14-hour days, dangerous machinery, poverty wages, sexual harassment by male supervisors. It called for labor reforms, for government oversight, for the workers to organize and demand their rights. The language was eloquent, passionate, and according to several newspaper accounts, shockingly unladylike in its directness and militancy. The mill owners were furious. A reward was offered for information about the pamphlet's author, and 3 days after the reward was announced, all 4 Whitmore sisters were admitted to Magnolia Asylum. The connection seemed obvious to Sarah, but she found no direct evidence. No one had ever been charged with authoring the pamphlet. The investigation had simply stopped, as if someone with power had decided it was better to let the matter drop. Sarah thought about the masked figure in the photograph, about Jane, the sister who didn't exist. Had she been the author? Had her family tried to hide her crime by erasing her from their family entirely? The storm outside was weakening, the thunder growing more distant. Sarah glanced at the clock and was startled to see it was past midnight. She had been working for more than 6 hours without a break. She should go home. But first, she wanted to check one more thing. She pulled up the asylum's architectural records, looking for floor plans and layout diagrams. Magnolia Asylum had been a sprawling complex, with multiple buildings spread across 50 acres. The main structure housed the administrative offices and common areas. Behind it were several smaller buildings, dormitories, treatment rooms, isolation wards. And at the far edge of the property, separated from the other structures by a dense grove of live oaks, was a building labeled simply Special Treatment Facility. Sarah zoomed in on the architectural drawing. The building was small, barely larger than a cottage. It had no windows, only one door, which opened to the outside, not toward the main asylum complex. And according to the notations, it had been constructed in 1893, just a year before Dr. Brennan arrived. A building with no windows, a building for patients who needed to be kept separate, isolated, hidden from view. Sarah's phone buzzed, making her jump. A text from Marcus. Just saw on the news that Meeting Street is flooded. You get home okay? She texted back. Still at the archive. Found something about the photograph. We need to talk. His response was immediate. It's almost 1 a.m. Go home. We'll talk tomorrow. He was right. She was exhausted, running on adrenaline and coffee, but she typed one more search into her computer. Magnolia Asylum Special Treatment Facility. The results were minimal. A few references in medical journals, all authored by Dr. Brennan, discussing the benefits of complete sensory isolation for recalcitrant female patients. One article mentioned that the facility could house up to 3 patients at a time, though typically only 1 was in residence. 1 patient, isolated from everyone else. Hidden away in a windowless building at the edge of the property, Sarah thought about the faceless figure in the photograph, standing behind the seated sisters, wearing a mask that prevented speech, prevented identity, prevented personhood. Had that been Jane's punishment? Not just commitment to an asylum, but complete erasure, locked away in darkness, unable to speak, unable to see or be seen. The implications made Sarah feel physically ill. She shut down her computer, gathered her notes, and prepared to leave. But as she was putting on her jacket, her eye caught on something she had missed before. The photograph was still pulled up on her second monitor, the one she used for image enhancement, and in the enhanced high-resolution version, she could see details that were invisible to the naked eye. The masked figure's hands were visible at her sides, and they weren't hanging naturally. They were clenched into fists, and there, barely visible against the white dress, were dark stains on the fabric near the wrists, blood from nails digging into palms with such force that they broke the skin. Sarah stared at that detail for a long moment. Then she saved all her research, backed up the files to 3 different locations, and left the archive. She had a feeling that what she was uncovering was dangerous, that someone, somewhere, didn't want this story told. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick and treacherous. Sarah drove home carefully, her mind churning with questions. Tomorrow she would dig deeper. Tomorrow she would find out what really happened to the Whitmore sisters. But tonight, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she couldn't stop thinking about that faceless figure, about a woman stripped of her voice, her identity, her very humanity. A woman who had committed the unforgivable crime of speaking out against injustice. And Sarah wondered how many other women had been erased from history in the same way. How many voices had been silenced. How many lives had been hidden away in windowless rooms and forgotten. The thought kept her awake until dawn. The next morning broke clear and humid, the kind of oppressive Charleston heat that made the air feel thick enough to swim through. Sarah arrived at the archive at 7:30, a full hour before official opening time. She had barely slept, her dreams populated by faceless figures and drowning women, and she was determined to make progress before Marcus arrived and tried to talk her out of her obsession. She made coffee in the small break room, strong enough to taste like bitterness and regret, and settled at her desk with renewed purpose. Today, she would find Jane Whitmore, or at least, she would find out what happened to her. Sarah started with property records. The Whitmore plantation had been located on the Ashley River, about 15 miles from Charleston proper. She pulled up historical maps and traced the property boundaries, noting that the land had remained in the family until 1923, when it was sold to a timber company. The house itself had burned down in 1931, taking with it any personal papers or family records that might have survived. Dead end. She moved on to church records. The Whitmores had been Episcopalians, members of St. Michael's Church on Meeting Street. Sarah requested the church registries from the archive's religious collection, and while she waited for them to be retrieved from storage, she continued her search through newspaper databases. She found a brief mention of the Whitmore sisters' deaths in the Charleston News and Courier from August 1896. The article was only 3 paragraphs long, buried on page 7 between advertisements for patent medicines and notices of ship arrivals. It stated that 4 young women had drowned in a tragic accident at the Magnolia Asylum, that they had apparently gone for a walk near the property's pond and fallen in during a moment of inattention from their caregivers. The article noted that all 4 had been suffering from nervous disorders and implied that their deaths, while tragic, were perhaps a merciful release from their suffering. There was no mention of suicide, no investigation, no questioning of how 4 adult women could drown in a pond simultaneously, just a neat, tidy story that absolved everyone of responsibility. Sarah's hands clenched around her coffee cup, hard enough that the ceramic creaked. She had seen this pattern before in her archival work, this casual erasure of inconvenient deaths. Women who died in asylums, in workhouses, in domestic service. Their deaths were rarely questioned, rarely investigated. They simply disappeared from the historical record, mourned briefly if at all, and then forgotten. But Sarah would not forget. She would not let the Whitmore sisters disappear. The church registries arrived, wheeled in on a cart by Derek, one of the archive's interns. He was a graduate student at the College of Charleston, working on a thesis about antebellum architecture, and he looked concerned when he saw Sarah's face. "You okay?" he asked. "You look like you haven't slept." Sarah managed a tight smile. "Working on a difficult case. Thanks for pulling these." She waited until he left before opening the first volume. The registry for St. Michael's Church was comprehensive, dating back to the church's founding in 1761. She flipped to the section covering births from 1867 to 1877, when the Whitmore sisters would have been born. Margaret, born 1871, Eleanor, born 1873, Catherine, born 1876, Alice, born 1879, all recorded in the same careful script, all baptized within weeks of their births. And then, in 1877, between Catherine and Alice, there was an entry that had been crossed out. Sarah's pulse quickened. She grabbed her magnifying glass and examined the entry closely. The ink used to cross it out was different from the original entry, darker and applied with heavier pressure. Someone had wanted this record gone, but they hadn't done a thorough enough job. Beneath the crossed-out lines, Sarah could just barely make out the words, Jane Constance Whitmore, born March 3, 1877, baptized March 24, 1877. Jane had existed. She had been born baptized, recognized by the church as a member of the Whitmore family. And then, at some point, someone had tried to erase that record. Sarah photographed the page with her phone, making sure to capture the crossed-out entry in detail. Then she continued through the registry, looking for any other mentions of Jane. She found one more in the section Recording Confirmations. In 1892, Jane Whitmore had been confirmed in the Episcopal Church, along with her sister Catherine. The entry was not crossed out, perhaps because whoever was erasing Jane from the records had missed it. So Jane had been alive and acknowledged by her family at least until 1892. She would have been 15 years old, 3 years before her sisters were committed to the asylum. What had happened in those 3 years? Sarah made a note to search for school records, social announcements, anything that might place Jane in Charleston during that time period. But first, she wanted to see if there were any death records she had missed. She pulled up the death registries again, this time searching not just 1896, but the entire decade surrounding it. No Jane Whitmore. She expanded the search to surrounding counties, to other states. Nothing. It was as if Jane had simply vanished sometime between 1892 and 1895. Or, Sarah thought with growing dread, she had been made to vanish. She thought again about the special treatment facility at Magnolia Asylum, about the building with no windows, designed for complete sensory isolation, about Dr. Brennan's articles describing his innovative treatments for rebellious women. What if Jane had never left that building? What if she had been locked away there, cut off from the world, kept in darkness and silence for years? The thought was almost too horrific to contemplate, but Sarah had learned in her years as an archivist that human cruelty knew no bounds, especially when it came to controlling and punishing women who dared to step outside the narrow confines of acceptable behavior. She needed to find more information about the special treatment facility. She needed to know who had been held there and for how long. Sarah spent the next 3 hours going through the asylum's financial records, looking for anything that might give her a clue. She found receipts for food deliveries, for medical supplies, for coal and lamp oil, and buried in the accounts from 1895, she found a series of payments to a company called Bentley Medical Apparatus for something listed only as custom restraint devices. The payments were substantial, much larger than the asylum's usual expenditures, and they were made monthly, from June 1895 through December 1901, 6.5 years of monthly payments for custom restraints. Sarah's stomach turned. She pulled up Dr. Brennan's publications again, reading more carefully this time. In one article from 1898, he mentioned a long-term patient who had been under his care for nearly 3 years of intensive treatment and who showed remarkable docility as a result of the therapeutic apparatus. 3 years as of 1898, which meant the patient had been admitted in 1895. The timeline matched. The Whitmore sisters were committed in August 1895. 4 of them died a year later. But what if there had been a 5th sister, one who didn't die, one who was kept alive in that windowless building for years, subjected to Dr. Brennan's experiments in breaking the human will? Sarah needed proof. She needed something concrete. something that would definitively link Jane Whitmore to the special treatment facility. She thought about the photograph again, about the masked figure standing behind her sisters. The photograph had been taken in August 1895, the same month the sisters were committed, which meant it had been taken early in their imprisonment, before they had been fully broken by Dr. Brennan's treatments. Had the photograph been meant as a warning, a way to show the sisters what awaited them if they didn't submit? Look at your sister, transformed into a voiceless, faceless thing. This could be you, or had it been something else? A way for Dr. Brennan to document his work, to create a record of his success in rendering a rebellious woman completely docile. Sarah pulled up the photograph on her screen again. She had examined it dozens of times, but now she looked at it with fresh eyes, searching for any detail she might have missed. And there, at the very bottom edge of the frame, partially cut off by the border, she saw something. A signature. She zoomed in, enhancing the image as much as she could without losing definition. The signature was small, written in white ink that blended into the light-colored step, but it was there. J. Brennan, 1895. Doctor. Brennan had taken the photograph himself. This wasn't a formal portrait created by a professional photographer. This was a doctor documenting his patients, his subjects, his victims. Sarah sat back, a wave of nausea washing over her. The photograph wasn't just evidence of what had happened to the Whitmore sisters. It was a trophy. Dr. Brennan's proof of his power over these women, his ability to reduce them to objects for his study. She thought about the fear in the sisters' eyes, the way they looked not at the camera, but at something just out of frame. They were looking at Dr. Brennan, at the man who held complete control over their lives, the man who could at any moment transform them into the faceless figure standing behind them. Sarah needed to talk to someone about this. She needed to share what she had found, to make sure this information didn't disappear if something happened to her, because she was increasingly certain that she was uncovering something that had been deliberately hidden, something that powerful people had wanted buried. She picked up her phone to call Marcus, but before she could dial, her email pinged with a new message. The subject line read, "Stop looking into the Whitmore case." Sarah's blood ran cold. She clicked on the email with shaking hands. The message was brief. "You're digging into things that should stay buried. For your own safety, drop this investigation. The past is past. Let the dead rest." It was sent from an anonymous email address, a string of random numbers and letters that gave no clue to the sender's identity. Sarah's first instinct was to delete it, to write it off as a prank. But something about the timing unnerved her. She had been careful in her research, had not discussed her findings with anyone except Marcus. How did someone know what she was investigating? She looked around the archive, suddenly aware of how alone she was. The building was old, full of shadows and hiding places. The security cameras were ancient and rarely reviewed. If someone wanted to hurt her, to stop her investigation, this would be the perfect place to do it. Sarah grabbed her phone and her notes and walked quickly to the front entrance. She locked the door behind her and stood on the steps, breathing in the humid Charleston air, trying to calm her racing heart. She was being paranoid. The email was probably just a coincidence or a prank from someone who had seen her research requests in the archives system. There was no actual threat. But as she stood there, trying to convince herself, she noticed a car parked across the street. A black sedan with tinted windows. It had been there when she arrived this morning, she was almost certain. And it was still there now, 4 hours later, in a metered parking spot. Sarah watched the car for a full minute. No one got out. No one got in. It just sat there, idling. She pulled out her phone and called Marcus. He answered on the third ring, his voice thick with sleep. "Sarah, what's wrong? I got a threatening email." she said, keeping her voice low. "Someone telling me to stop investigating the Whitmore case." There was a long pause. Then, "Are you at the archive?" "Outside, Marcus. I think someone's watching me. Get in your car and drive to the police station. Now, I'm getting dressed and I'll meet you there." "I'm probably overreacting," Sarah said, even as her eyes stayed locked on the black sedan. "I don't care. Go to the police station. Let them decide if you're overreacting." Sarah ended the call and walked quickly to her car, parked in the employee lot behind the building. She kept glancing over her shoulder, but no one followed her. The black sedan remained where it was. She drove to the downtown police station, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. By the time she arrived, Marcus was already there, waiting outside. He pulled her into a brief hug. "You okay?" "I'm fine, just spooked." Inside, they were directed to a detective named Rachel Torres, a woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Sarah explained the situation. The photograph, her research, the anonymous email. Detective Torres listened carefully, making notes. "Do you have the email with you?" Sarah pulled it up on her phone and handed it over. Torres read it, her expression unreadable. "This is concerning," she said finally, "but without more concrete threats, there's not much we can do. I can file a report, and we can increase patrols near the archive, but I'd recommend you take some basic precautions. Vary your routine, make sure people know where you are. Don't go to the archive alone." "Do you think I'm in actual danger?" Sarah asked. Torres hesitated. "I think you've stumbled onto something that someone doesn't want uncovered. Whether that someone is dangerous or just angry, I can't say, but it's better to be cautious." Sarah thanked her and left the station with Marcus. They stood outside in the morning heat, neither quite sure what to say. "You should stop," Marcus said finally. "Whatever you're investigating, it's not worth getting hurt over." "It's about 5 women who were tortured and killed," Sarah said quietly. "It's about a system that allowed men like Dr. Brennan to operate with impunity, that let women be locked away and erased for the crime of having opinions. I can't just stop because someone sent me a scary email." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. "Sarah, they've been dead for over 100 years. You can't save them. But I can make sure they're not forgotten. I can make sure their story is told." They stared at each other for a long moment. Then Marcus sighed. "Fine, but I'm helping you. You don't go to the archive alone anymore, and you share everything you find with me immediately. Deal?" Sarah felt a rush of gratitude. Deal. They drove back to the archive together, Marcus following in his car. The black sedan was gone. Sarah wasn't sure if that made her feel better or worse. Back at her desk, with Marcus working at the table beside her, Sarah continued her research. She searched for any information about what had happened to Dr. Brennan after he left Magnolia Asylum in 1902. The trail was frustratingly cold. No death certificate, no evidence of him practicing medicine elsewhere, no census records or tax documents. It was as if he, like Jane Whitmore, had simply been erased from history. But then Sarah found something interesting. In 1903, a Dr. J.B. Rennick began publishing articles about the treatment of female nervous disorders. The articles were remarkably similar in tone and content to Dr. Brennan's work, advocating for the same harsh treatments, the same focus on breaking the will of rebellious patients. Sarah pulled up Dr. Rennick's publications and compared them to Dr. Brennan's. The writing style was nearly identical, the same unusual phrasings, the same circular logic justifying cruelty as therapy. She did a search for Dr. J.B. Rennick and found that he had worked at an asylum in North Carolina from 1903 to 1908. After that, his trail went cold as well. Sarah's mind raced. What if Brennan and Rennick were the same person? What if Dr. Brennan had simply changed his name and moved to a new location, continuing his work under a different identity? She found a photograph of Dr. Rennick from a medical journal published in 1905. The image was grainy, but the resemblance was unmistakable. The same heavy brow, the same intense eyes, the same thin-lipped mouth. Dr. Brennan had not disappeared. He had reinvented himself. Sarah wondered how many other women he had tortured in his new position. How many lives had been destroyed by his treatments. She was about to share her discovery with Marcus when her computer pinged with a new email notification. Another message from the same anonymous address. This one read, "Final warning. You have no idea what you're interfering with. Walk away now." Sarah's hands trembled as she showed the email to Marcus. He read it, his face grave. "That's it," he said. "We're going to the police again. This is escalating." But before they could leave, Sarah's phone rang. It was Detective Torres. "Miss Chen, I did some digging after you left," Torres said without preamble. "I ran a background check on the person who owns the property where Magnolia Asylum used to stand. The land was sold in 1924, but it stayed in the same family for generations. The current owner is a man named Thomas Whitmore." Sarah's breath caught. "Whitmore? As in related to the sisters you're researching. Thomas Whitmore is the great-great-grandson of John Whitmore, the father of Margaret, Eleanor, Catherine, Alice, and Jane. Why would he care about me investigating what happened to his ancestors?" "That's what I'm wondering," Torres said. "I think you should come back to the station. I want to ask Mr. Whitmore some questions, and I'd like you here when I do." Sarah and Marcus drove back to the police station. Thomas Whitmore arrived with a lawyer. He was silver-haired, impeccably dressed in his 60s. Torres questioned him while Sarah and Marcus watched through one-way glass. "Mr. Whitmore, have you been sending threatening emails to Ms. Sarah Chen?" "I have no idea who that is," Whitmore replied smoothly. "She's investigating what happened to your great-great-aunts at Magnolia Asylum." Something flickered in his eyes. "That's tragic family history, but it's in the past. Ms. Chen has received threatening emails. You own the property where the asylum stood." Whitmore's lawyer intervened. "Unless you have evidence linking him to these emails, this conversation is over." Torres let him go. "He's lying," she told Sarah, "but without proof, I can't hold him. Be careful. Whatever the Whitmore family is hiding, it must be big." Sarah returned to the archive with renewed determination. She had protection now. Marcus was with her, police were aware, and she had backup copies stored securely. She spent the day going through Whitmore family documentation. Slowly, a picture emerged. The anonymous pamphlet about mill conditions hadn't been written by one person. It had been a collaborative effort by all 5 Whitmore sisters, each contributing sections based on their own observations. They had infiltrated the mills by posing as workers, experiencing the brutal conditions firsthand. They had interviewed dozens of workers, compiled evidence of wage theft, sexual harassment, unsafe conditions, and child labor. And they had been prepared to testify before a legislative committee. But John Whitmore had intervened. He owned stock in 2 criticized mills. The scandal would have ruined him. So he had his daughters committed, not because they were insane, but because they were dangerous. Sarah found evidence in old bank records, regular transfers from John Whitmore to Dr. Brennan, starting in 1895 and continuing until 1902. The 4 sisters who drowned in 1896 had likely been murdered when they refused to recant. But Jane, the one who had been erased from all records, had suffered a different fate. Sarah thought about the special treatment facility, about the windowless building at the edge of the asylum grounds, about 6.5 years of payments for custom restraints. Jane hadn't died in 1896. She'd been kept alive, locked in darkness, unable to speak or scream or be heard. A living ghost, erased from existence, but denied the mercy of death. And when Dr. Brennan finally left Charleston in 1902, what had happened to her? Had she been moved with him to North Carolina? Had she finally been killed? Or had she been left behind, locked in that windowless room until she died of neglect? Sarah needed to know. She needed to find out what had happened to Jane Whitmore, to give her story the ending it deserved. But as she sat there, surrounded by documents and photographs and pieces of a horrific puzzle, she felt the weight of what she was uncovering. This wasn't just history. This was a testament to systematic oppression, to the way society had silenced women who dared to speak truth to power. And someone, probably Thomas Whitmore, protecting his family's legacy, wanted to keep that silence intact. Sarah looked at the photograph on her screen, at the masked figure standing behind her four sisters, at a woman who had been stripped of her voice, her identity, her humanity. "I won't let them forget you," Sarah whispered to the image. "I promise." The third day of Sarah's investigation began with rain again, a steady drizzle that turned Charleston's historic streets into rivers of Spanish moss and fallen petals. She arrived at the archive to find Marcus already there, dark circles under his eyes, suggesting he'd slept as poorly as she had. "I've been thinking," he said, without preamble, "about the special treatment facility. It was built in 1893, 2 years before the Whitmore sisters were committed. What if Jane wasn't Dr. Brennan's first patient? What if there were others before her?" Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't considered that possibility. She had been so focused on the Whitmore sisters that she hadn't thought about what Dr. Brennan might have been doing before they arrived. "We need to find out who was in that building," Sarah said. "All of them." They spent the morning cross-referencing asylum admission records with the financial documents Sarah had uncovered. The pattern that emerged was damning. Starting in 1893, there were regular payments to Bentley Medical Apparatus, the company that supplied the custom restraint devices. The payments corresponded with the admission of certain patients, all women, all diagnosed with moral insanity or rebellious hysteria. These weren't women with genuine mental illness. They were women who had transgressed social boundaries. A suffragette who had organized a protest, a journalist who had written critical articles about city officials, a teacher who had advocated for integrated schools, a factory worker who had tried to form a union. Each one had been committed to Magnolia Asylum. Each one had disappeared from the historical record. And the financial evidence suggested that each one had spent time in the special treatment facility. Sarah counted at least 12 women between 1893 and 1902 when Dr. Brennan left Charleston. 12 women subjected to God knows what horrors in that windowless building. "We need to go there," Sarah said suddenly, "to where the asylum used to be. There might be something left, some evidence." Marcus looked skeptical. "Thomas Whitmore owns that property. After yesterday, I don't think showing up there is a good idea." "So we don't ask permission?" Marcus stared at her. "You want to trespass on the property of a man who's already threatened you?" "I want to find the truth, and I don't think we're going to find it in these documents. We need to see the actual site." Marcus ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Sarah had come to recognize as his way of processing difficult decisions. "Okay," he said finally, "but we go during the day, we tell someone where we're going, and at the first sign of trouble, we leave. Agreed?" "Agreed." They drove out to the old asylum site that afternoon, following roads that became progressively narrower and less maintained. The property was located about 20 miles from downtown Charleston, nestled in a bend of the Ashley River, where the live oaks grew so thick that they blocked out most of the sunlight. The main asylum building had been demolished decades ago, but some of the outbuildings remained, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Sarah and Marcus parked on the side of the road and walked in. Following what had once been a gravel drive but was now mostly weeds and broken pavement, The air was thick with humidity and the smell of decay. Insects buzzed in clouds around them. Sarah tried to imagine this place as it had been in the 1890s, full of women whose only crime had been to think for themselves, to speak out against injustice, to refuse to be silenced. "There," Marcus said, pointing through the trees. Sarah saw it, a small brick building, partially hidden by overgrown vegetation. It was roughly 20 feet square, with walls that had once been painted white but were now stained green with moss and mildew. The roof was partially collapsed, and ivy grew thick across the walls, but it had no windows, just as the architectural plans had shown. The special treatment facility. Sarah's heart pounded as they approached. The single door hung crooked on its hinges, swollen with moisture and rot. Marcus pushed it open, and it gave way with a screech of protesting metal. The interior was dark and dank, smelling of earth and decay. Sarah pulled out her phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam revealed a small room, empty except for debris and dead leaves that had blown in through the damaged roof. But there on the far wall were iron rings embedded in the brick, 4 of them evenly spaced at roughly shoulder height. Restraints for keeping someone chained in place. Sarah moved closer, her light revealing more details, scratches in the brick around the rings, as if someone had tried desperately to pry them free. And lower down, near the floor, more scratches, deliberate ones this time, forming letters. Sarah knelt down, brushing away years of accumulated dirt and debris. The letters were crude, scraped into the brick with something sharp. A nail, perhaps, or a piece of metal scavenged from somewhere. The scratches formed words. "Jane Whitmore was here. Remember me." Sarah's vision blurred with tears. She was looking at a message from 1895, from a woman who had known she was being erased from history, who had fought to leave some proof of her existence. "Oh, God," Marcus whispered from behind her. He had found something else. Sarah turned. Marcus was standing in the corner of the room, looking down at the floor. She joined him, directing her light downward. There, partially covered by debris, was a trapdoor. It was made of heavy wood, reinforced with iron straps, and it had a padlock that had long since rusted away. Marcus and Sarah looked at each other. Then, working together, they cleared away the debris and pried open the trapdoor. A ladder descended into darkness. The smell that emerged was overwhelming. Dampness, rot, and something else. Something that made Sarah's stomach churn. "We should call the police," Marcus said. "Not yet. We need to see what's down there first." Sarah descended the ladder carefully, testing each rung before putting her weight on it. The space below was larger than she had expected, a cellar-like room carved out of the earth. Her phone light revealed stone walls, a dirt floor, and in the corner, something that made her blood run cold. Human remains, not just one skeleton, multiple sets of bones, jumbled together as if they had been thrown down here and forgotten. Sarah counted at least 6 skulls in the tangle of yellowed bones. She thought about the 12 women who had been admitted to the special treatment facility, about the payments for restraints that had continued for years, about Dr. Brennan's articles describing his success in breaking rebellious patients. This was where they had ended up. The ones who had died during his treatments, or who had been killed when they were no longer useful subjects for his experiments, disposed of like garbage, hidden away in a hole in the ground where no one would find them. Sarah climbed back up the ladder, her legs shaking. Marcus took one look at her face and pulled out his phone. "We're calling the police now," he said firmly. Sarah nodded. She had found her proof. She had found the victims, but instead of triumph, she felt only a crushing sadness. Detective Torres arrived within an hour, bringing with her a team of forensic investigators and crime scene technicians. Sarah and Marcus watched from a distance as the cellar was photographed, measured, and carefully excavated. Torres came over to where they stood. "This is going to be a massive investigation," she said. "We're looking at potential evidence of multiple homicides, even if they occurred over a century ago. The medical examiner will need to examine the remains, try to determine cause of death and identity." "How many bodies are down there?" Sarah asked. "We're still counting, but preliminary estimate is 8 or 9 individuals, all female, based on the pelvic bones. 8 or 9 women. 8 or 9 lives ended in that dark cellar, their deaths hidden and forgotten." "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Now we investigate. We'll try to identify the remains, cross-reference with missing persons reports from the time period, and we'll be looking very closely at Thomas Whitmore and his family's connection to all of this." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a car pulled up to the property. Thomas Whitmore emerged, his face red with anger. "What the hell is going on here?" he demanded. "This is private property. You're all trespassing." Torres walked over to meet him. "Mr. Whitmore, we have evidence of multiple homicides on this property. This is now an active crime scene." "Homicides? That's ridiculous. This is just—" He stopped, seeming to realize that anything he said could incriminate him. His lawyer, who had arrived with him, stepped forward. "My client has nothing to do with whatever you think you found here." "Perhaps not directly," Torres said, "but he certainly seems invested in keeping people from looking into his family history. I'm going to need to ask you some questions, Mr. Whitmore, downtown at the station." Whitmore's face paled. "Am I being arrested?" "Not at this time, but I strongly suggest you cooperate with our investigation." As Torres led Whitmore away, Sarah felt a strange mixture of vindication and sorrow. They had uncovered the truth, but the truth was so much worse than she had imagined. Over the next week, the investigation unfolded. The medical examiner confirmed that the remains in the cellar belonged to 9 women, aged approximately 16 to 35 at the time of death. Several showed signs of prolonged physical trauma, healed fractures, damage to the jaw and teeth consistent with forced feeding through the restrictive masks Dr. Brennan had described in his articles. Sarah worked closely with the forensic team, providing historical context and helping to identify the victims through old records. They matched 8 of the 9 sets of remains to women who had been admitted to Magnolia Asylum between 1893 and 1901. The 9th remained unidentified, but Sarah had her suspicions. She requested that DNA testing be done on all the remains, including comparison with any surviving descendants of the Whitmore family. Thomas Whitmore refused to provide a sample, but his lawyer couldn't prevent the court from ordering it. The results came back 2 weeks later. One set of remains showed a familial match to Thomas Whitmore. Jane Whitmore had been found. Sarah stood in Detective Torres's office, looking at the report. Jane had died sometime in her early 20s, roughly 5 to 7 years after she was first committed to the asylum. The cause of death couldn't be determined with certainty, but the medical examiner noted extensive damage to her skeleton consistent with prolonged restraint and physical abuse. She had spent years in that windowless building, chained to the wall, wearing the mask that Sarah had seen in the photograph, years of darkness and silence and suffering. And when she finally died, Dr. Brennan had simply thrown her body into the cellar with the others and continued his work. "We're building a case against Thomas Whitmore for obstruction of justice and making criminal threats," Torres said. "He knew about those bodies. Family oral history passed down through generations. That's why he tried to stop your investigation." "Will he go to prison?" "For the threats and obstruction? Probably. For what his great-great-grandfather did, no. Those crimes are too far in the past, but we're also looking into whether he violated any laws regarding the disposal of human remains or the concealment of deaths." Sarah nodded. Justice was complicated, especially when the crimes were more than a century old. But at least the truth was known now. At least the women who had died in that cellar would be properly buried, their names remembered. She thought about the message Jane had scratched into the brick. Remember me. I want to arrange a proper burial for all of them, Sarah said. A memorial. Something that honors who they were and what they stood for. Torres smiled. I think that's a wonderful idea. Sarah spent the next month planning a memorial service with local historians, women's rights organizations, and families of the victims. The remains were laid to rest in Magnolia Cemetery under a monument listing all 9 names. The inscription read, "They spoke truth to power. They demanded justice for the powerless. They were silenced, but not forgotten. May we honor their courage by continuing their fight." The service was attended by hundreds. Sarah spoke about remembering uncomfortable histories, about not allowing the powerful to bury their crimes. These women were erased because they threatened the status quo, Sarah said. They were labeled as insane, as hysterical, but they saw injustice and refused to stay silent. She looked at the monument. We can't bring them back, but we can make sure their voices are finally heard. We can tell their stories, and we can continue the work they started. After the service, an elderly woman approached. Ms. Chen? I'm Elizabeth Brennan, great-granddaughter of Dr. Josiah Brennan. Sarah's first instinct was anger, but something in the woman's face stopped her. I'm ashamed of what my ancestor did. Thank you for bringing the truth to light. She pulled out a leather-bound journal. This was found among my great-grandfather's belongings. It's his diary from Magnolia Asylum. Sarah's hands trembled as she took the journal. Have you read it? Enough to know that it contains the details of what he did to those poor women. Medical observations, descriptions of his treatments, his thoughts on their progress. It's monstrous. But it's also evidence, proof of what happened. Why give it to me? Elizabeth's eyes filled with tears. Because they deserve to have their full story told. And because I need to know that something good came from my family's legacy, even if it's just the truth finally being known. Sarah would read it. As painful as that would be, she would document Dr. Brennan's crimes in full, and she would make sure the complete story was preserved for future generations. As she stood in the cemetery, Sarah thought about freedom, not the abstract concept, but what it meant to be free to speak, to challenge injustice. The women buried here had fought for that freedom and paid with their lives. They had been silenced by a system that feared their voices, but they had not been forgotten. Their story would be told, and in the telling, they would finally be free. Sarah looked at the grey Charleston sky, feeling the weight of history and the hope of the future. The fight for freedom was never over. Each generation had to take up the struggle anew. The Whitmore sisters had done their part. Now it was Sarah's turn to continue the work, to remember, to resist, to refuse to be silenced. The photograph that had started it all now had context. It was no longer just a mysterious relic. It was a testament to courage and cruelty, to the price of speaking out. Sarah had it professionally restored and donated it to the Charleston County Museum for an exhibit on women's history. Beneath the photograph, a placard displayed words from the sisters' 1895 pamphlet. We are told to know our place, to accept the world as it is. But we cannot be silent. We have seen the suffering of our fellow women. We speak not because we wish to cause trouble, but because silence makes us complicit in injustice. We speak because we must. Those words, written by young women who had paid the ultimate price, would endure and inspire future generations. And that, Sarah thought, was the best memorial of all. As the sun set over Charleston, casting long shadows across the cemetery, Sarah said goodbye to the 9 women resting beneath the monument. She promised them that their story would not be forgotten, that their voices would echo through time. "Remember me," Jane Whitmore had scratched into the brick wall of her prison. Sarah would make sure that everyone remembered, all of them, forever. Thomas Whitmore was convicted of obstruction of justice and served 2 years in prison. His family's reputation was destroyed. The asylum property was sold and turned into a memorial park. The special treatment facility was preserved as a historical site, a reminder of atrocities that could occur when authority went unchecked. Sarah continued her work at the archive, changed by her experience. She made it her mission to seek out silenced stories, to give voice to the voiceless, because freedom meant the right to be remembered, to have your story told, to exist in the historical record with dignity. The Whitmore sisters had been denied that right in life, but Sarah had given it back to them in death. And in doing so, she reminded everyone that freedom was never guaranteed. It had to be fought for, generation after generation. The price of freedom was vigilance. The price of silence was complicity. Sarah would never be silent again, and she would make sure that the voices of those 9 women, silenced so long ago, would continue to speak across the decades. The photograph of the 5 sisters, with its haunting, faceless figure, had become a symbol of that fight. It hung in the museum, a reminder of what had been done to women who dared to challenge power. Sarah visited it often, standing before the image and feeling the weight of history and the possibility of change. "I remembered you," she would whisper to the faceless figure, to Jane Whitmore. "We all remember you now." And in that remembering, there was a kind of freedom. Not the freedom Jane had been denied in life, but a freedom that transcended death, that lived on in the stories told. The fight for freedom continued, but now the Whitmore sisters were part of that fight. They had not died in vain. Their suffering had meaning. Their story would endure. And that was the greatest triumph, to take the darkest moment of history and transform it into a light that could guide future generations toward a more just world. Sarah left the museum that evening with a sense of peace. She had done what she set out to do. She had given the Whitmore sisters and their fellow victims the memorial they deserved. She had exposed the crimes that had been hidden for over a century. As she walked through the streets of Charleston, past buildings that held so many secrets, she thought about all the other voices waiting to be heard. Her work was far from over. There were always more stories to tell, more forgotten voices to amplify, but tonight she had given 9 women back their names, their stories, their dignity. The rain had stopped, and the stars were beginning to emerge. Sarah looked up and smiled. "Rest in peace," she said softly. "You're free now." And somewhere in the darkness, 9 voices whispered back, "Remember, resist, never be silent." Sarah would carry those words with her for the rest of her life, and she would make sure that everyone who heard the story carried them too. Because that was how freedom was preserved, one story at a time, one voice at a time, one act of remembrance at a time. The faceless figure in the photograph was faceless no longer. She was Jane Whitmore, a woman who had fought for justice and paid with her life, a woman who had been erased from history but refused to be forgotten, a woman who, in death, had become a symbol of the ongoing struggle for freedom. Remember, resist, never be silent. Those were the words that would guide her. Those were the words that would light the way forward. And as long as those words endured, as long as people remembered the cost of silence and the price of freedom, the Whitmore sisters would never truly die. They would live on, not as victims, but as heroes, not as the silenced, but as voices that could never be fully quieted. That was their legacy. That was their gift to future generations. And Sarah would make sure that gift was never forgotten.